A very warm welcome to this keynote interview on climate action and the path to net zero. As you've heard, my name's Clare Foster. I'm a banking partner at law firm Shepherd and Wedderburn, and I also head up our clean energy practice at the firm. And as we draw near to the 12-month countdown to COP26, which, as you know, is due to be held in Glasgow in November 2021, it's timely to take stock of where we stand globally on the progress made towards net zero, what's been achieved so far, and the huge amount which remains to be done. To what extent attitudes across all sectors may have changed in looking at the challenges of decarbonisation, and to explore how the financial sector will play a critical role in the journey to net zero carbon emissions. This morning, I have the real pleasure of interviewing Chris Stark. Chris is the Chief Executive of the UK Committee on Climate Change, which is the public body tasked by the Climate Change Act to be the independent authority on tackling climate change. Chris leads a team of analysts and specialists offering expert insight into the challenges of reducing UK emissions and adapting to the changing climate. Now, Chris led the CCC's work in 2019 to recommend a new net zero target for the UK, which is now brought into law at UK level. As you may be aware, we now have a 2050 net zero target UK-wide. And in Scottish terms, Scotland has a more ambitious target of net zero carbon emissions by 2045. The statistics in the net zero report produced by the CCC make for sobering reading, and the challenges are enormous, but they're not unachievable. We need to remember, though, that these targets were set before COVID-19 reared its head earlier this year and had a devastating effect on our lives and the economy. Chris, I'm delighted to welcome you here this morning, as there are very few better qualified to talk through where we currently stand in tackling climate change and what changes need to happen to achieve our net zero aspirations. May I invite you now to share your introductory remarks on climate action and the path to net zero, your thoughts on the global transition and how and where the financial sector must help. Then afterwards, we'll hopefully have some time to explore some of the key issues around barriers, cooperation and the investment piece. Chris.
Thanks, Claire. Quite an introduction. Thanks very much, and thanks so much for letting me kick you off this morning. I'm going to try, if I can, to cut through some of the gloom today. Now, there is a lot of gloom around, but I think it's really important to try and give a kind of balanced assessment of where we are at the moment. I'm going to try and offer you my view of where we're heading on tackling climate change. And well, let's see how I get on, but I hope I can convince you that this is actually quite an optimistic story, in fact, increasingly optimistic, even though, of course, the stakes are very, very high. Hopefully that's going to kick off the next 4 days in the right spirit. So let me talk about climate change. It is very, very clearly a global issue. But it's also about changes that we're going to experience at home. So I wanted to make that point because I'm speaking to you today in these very odd times from my home, which is in Glasgow. And we've just heard Glasgow will be the host of the next major climate summit. And we're about to begin that 12-month countdown to COP26. So what I'd like to try and do in 10 minutes or so is just trying to connect the global issues of climate change with those domestic issues if I can. And I actually think here in the UK, we are unusually well placed to do that. But let me start with the global. And we certainly do face an enormous challenge when it comes to climate change. You are all experiencing climate change right now. The extreme weather events that you're seeing happening around the world right now, the forest fires, the tropical storms, the heat waves, the torrential rain, the flooding, they are indeed happening, and they are indeed happening more frequently and with greater severity. We used to think of these kind of events as what we call long tail events. That is quite unlikely. Now they have been made much more likely by the warming of our planet that we have caused, of course, by using fossil fuels. Today, sadly, we're at a concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that the world has not seen for probably 3 million years. And 3 million years ago, the sea was about 20 meters higher than it is today. So we are now seeing the disappearance of glaciers, rising seas, changes in weather, all things that science has predicted actually very accurately for some time since we properly started to understand the climate impacts. All of that is at 1 degree of warming. So 1 degree of warming since the Industrial Revolution. And most of that warming you can attribute to emissions of greenhouse gases in the last 50 years. So we've really accelerated the pace of change. And it's causing the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere to really rocket. That's 1 degree, but right now we are on course for something more like 3 degrees of warming, and there's every chance it could be even higher than that. 4 degrees of warming is within scope. It is genuinely hard to communicate the impacts of global warming at that kind of scale. They will destroy pre-existing views of how we live and how we work, even where we live and where we work, where we inhabit in this planet. So I'm afraid that's the bad news. And every single day that passes, we are adding to this cumulative chronic problem of climate change. Even this year, in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of a huge economic slowdown, we are adding to the problem of climate change. But the good news, and most of what we will now talk about is good news, is that we can do something about this. We reckon another 0.5 degree centigrade of warming is probably all but inevitable. But beyond that, it's on us. So the future warming that we will see globally will be determined by our choice of whether we continue to use fossil fuels or whether we move decisively to net zero. That's a climate choice. It is not inevitable that we will see these damaging impacts. We have at our disposal the tools to address it. And that's what brings me to net zero, which of course has become a bit of a slogan amazingly in the last 18 months, but it's really a scientific goal. It's just the point when we stop adding to the cumulative problem of greenhouse gas concentrations in the Earth's atmosphere. And as soon as we do that, it's also the point when we will stop warming the planet. And that brings us to Paris. So 5 years ago, every country of the world, even the United States, agreed to act in this and to restrict warming to 2 degrees centigrade above where it was pre-industry, with best efforts for 1.5 degrees. And that requires a global effort. It is a global goal of reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions, probably sometime in the 2070s. So that's the implication of Paris. If we look at just carbon dioxide alone, those emissions that are produced when we use fossil fuels for energy, well, that needs to get to net zero even earlier, sometime in the 2050s. If you were to look at the global emissions chart of how we achieve the Paris Agreement, what you would see is a mountain. So emissions rising steeply until around the 2020s, then the handbrake turn effectively as global emissions head back down to net zero. And I want you to think about that mountain analogy. We need to start beginning the descent from that mountain as quickly as possible. So let me try and be your Sherpa for that descent. Many people accept everything that I've just said to you, but they look at that mountain and they shake their head. They don't see how we can reverse the trajectory of emissions. Well, I think we can. And that's because the fundamentals of decarbonisation, the economics globally, get better and better every year. So this looks less and less like some sort of hair-shirted ambition and more like a straightforwardly sensible prospectus for investment, regardless of your views on climate change. The facts are that the alternatives to fossil fuels are plummeting in price globally, plummeting. For power generation, you can look at global auction prices right now and you can see already that renewables are as cheap or cheaper than their fossil fueled alternatives. Here in the UK, utterly remarkable, offshore wind is now the cheapest form of electricity, bar none, electricity generation, I should say. It is going to become the backbone of the UK's entire energy system over the coming decade and beyond. And of course, with that, the new demands that there are going to be for all that cheap, clean electricity in transport and heat, in industry, that's going to drive huge innovation. So new technological progress, also new market models, new forms of consumer engagement, all sorts of change. And investors are not going to wait for those kind of price tipping points. They are already looking ahead. They are already allocating capital to those decarbonised alternatives. So it turns out that decarbonisation is actually a recipe for real disruption and positive disruption, real progress. We are seeing that right now in the energy sector, and we're about to see that in the automotive sector when we see that cheap, clean electricity meet cheap battery storage. Who would have thought just a few years ago that every major automotive manufacturer in the world would have plans to stop producing internal combustion engine vehicles? That is astonishing. And there is absolutely no reason to believe that that technological progress, those manufacturing gains that have been driving prices down for the consumer, is going to stop. The progress that we've seen in renewables and battery technology over the last 10 years is going to continue. There is no reason to believe that disruption and progress is going to stop there. There is industry, heating, and a host of other sectoral challenges still to come. And that's why I think net zero is so important. That's the reason why China signed up to net zero just a fortnight ago. It is, I doubt, through some philanthropic aim. It is really because it is an economic imperative that we get on top of net zero. So I think it's entirely possible for us to get on the right trajectory, but we have to model the change at home. There is a real responsibility for us, particularly in the UK, as one of the leading developed economies, to take a lead on achieving net zero emissions. And if COP26 is going to be a success in Glasgow next year, then net zero and the green recovery are going to have to be the story that we see repeated over and over again over the next 12 months. As COP president, the UK is going to have to lead that charge. So here in the UK, my organisation, the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, has actually been assessing what it would be necessary to do to get to net zero. We've offered advice on that, and we offered that advice last year that you referred to, Clare, which led to the setting of the new statutory target. In that advice, we said that net zero was necessary, it was feasible, and it was cost effective. And it's the feasible and cost effective bit that I just want to turn to in the last couple of minutes. Net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 is the statutory target, it's the law of the land now in the UK, but it's quite a bit more than just a target for emissions. What it implies is really that over the next 3 decades, we are going to have to invest at a scale we have never invested at as a country to turn over the entire capital stock of a country actually remarkably quickly to become zero carbon. Now that implies a fundamental shift in every sector, in every region, in every industry. And for me, that's the exciting bit about net zero. It's going to be a tool of economic renewal, something that we really need to start thinking carefully about. We need to cling on to this as in the midst of the COVID crisis, of course, that's still unfolding. I think climate investments can actually lead the economy out of the situation that we're in now. But the scale and the speed of that transition is going to have to cause us to think again about how we mobilise the necessary funding across those different sectors. Here in the UK, we estimate that we'll probably need of the order of £50 billion a year of extra capital investment each year. So that's what's going to lead to the full decarbonisation of road transport, 40 million vehicles, the full decarbonisation of buildings, 30 million buildings in the UK. That's what's going to fully decarbonise industry. That's what's going to allow us to double the size of our power sector. That's what's going to see us supply 10 times at least more hydrogen than we do today as a new low carbon fuel, a wholly new sector of carbon capture and greenhouse gas removals as well. I could go on. Most of that 50 billion extra a year is capital investment that will be privately funded. So that speaks to the need for policies that are going to keep the cost of capital low, things that provide strong long-term certainty for investors so that we reduce the policy risk that drives cost of capital up. It is a capital intensive transition, but crucially it's something that is entirely achievable. We know what must be done in all of those sectors. The solutions are not unicorn solutions. They are well understood, they are well researched. We estimate that by the early 2030s, all investments in the UK, every car, every heating installation, every piece of plant machinery needs to be zero carbon. So this is the decade when we put those plans in place, when we scale up, we make those policies and we see the investor response. That 50 billion I talked about is about 1% of GDP. And it happens to also be the figure for the global transition to net zero. So just think about that, 1% of GDP to end global warming within a generation. That is remarkably small, I think, a price entirely worth paying. And that capital, therefore, is something we just need to think about how we mobilise. So I believe it will be mobilised. What we're already seeing is telling me that it's happening. We're already seeing the high carbon sectors being disrupted. You've seen the impairments for some of the big oil majors, for example. Shareholders and banks are now pressing for those clear net zero plans that we need. There's no shortage of capital for solid net zero investments. COVID has actually accelerated that pace. ESG investments are easily outperforming the stock market. You can look at the likes of Ørsted, for example, to show what happens when you see a dramatic corporate transformation to decarbonisation over a relatively short period successfully. And I think it also shows us that well-designed policy drives this. So that's, for me, the exciting thing in all this. So I just wanted to end with a positive framing, if I can, Clare, 5 steps to kind of really pull this off. Firstly, the prize. So the investment requirements to achieve net zero can be met if we have effective policies and market frameworks in place quickly. It's policy design that's going to determine whether it's cheap or expensive to finance this transition. So we look right now to our political leaders for the policies on that. Secondly, on mindset. So the mindset needs to shift, I think, from measuring the risks of climate change, so the transition risks of achieving net zero or the physical risks of climate change itself. We need to shift from that to aligning finance with net zero, with climate change resilience, with the just transition that will make this a fair transition overall. Thirdly, on the economy itself, the real economy policies need to be investable to attract increased capital into those investments at low cost. That means, of course, technology investments, but it's also about business model changes. We have to think about that too. And that, for me, is a really strong message to this audience. Fourthly, the financial system. This is not just a technical system challenge, although it's often people like me that lead you to believe that. It's actually also a challenge for the wider financial system and regulatory system that we have. That also needs to be net zero proofed. There are institutional gaps that need to be filled to increase the efficiency of capital intermediation here. We need to consider if we have all the financial institutions that we need to mobilize and finance capital at the right scale. And lastly, back to the global question, the global architecture for all this. Successful net zero financing is also going to depend on an effective international finance architecture. So the finance ministries, the central banks, the capital markets, development finance. And I really see that as a key message for COP26 next year. This is the opportunity to start putting that architecture in place. And I think if we do that, it's also realistic to think that we can have UK leadership on those issues. These are of course, so many of the expertise and specialisms that we have in the UK. So I really feel that this is the moment. And even though we have a pandemic, I'm so excited about what's coming next. So with that, I'll say back to you, Claire.
Thanks, Chris. A huge amount of food for thought. And quite frankly, I could speak to you for days about some of this stuff because I know we're both evangelists about how to get there. But we've got just over 20 minutes. And so I'm going to focus on 3 key issues now. The first question really is about COVID. 2020 was to be the year of climate action, but then COVID-19 happened. And since Q1, it continues to have an enormous impact globally. How do you think that has actually affected plans for the global transition and path to net zero? Because it's been catastrophic.
Well, it has been catastrophic. And it's quite right that COVID has dominated the thoughts of our political leaders in the news cycle. There are 2 crises here. There is the COVID crisis and there is the climate crisis, but they are very different in their nature, and we should approach them differently. I mean, there is no doubt that COVID is going to change everything. I mean, the impact of COVID itself on climate is actually remarkably small. Almost not worth talking about, even though this will be a historic record for the fall in greenhouse gas emissions that we see this year, somewhere between 5 and 10%, we think, because of the global slowdown. That really doesn't change very much when it comes to climate change itself. What it does is kind of throw this kind of tarpaulin over everything that comes next. So, we need to think about tackling climate change whilst now tackling the pandemic, but crucially what comes after the pandemic, the economic crisis. And for me, that's the linking point. So again, you've probably picked up, I am an optimist about this, but I think we need to start thinking about using those climate investments that I talked about as the means to come out of this. And if we do that, if we mobilize the capital, if we have those solid policies I talked about from government, if we focus on those investments that we know that will decarbonize the economy, well, actually, the opportunity here is to come out of this with an even sharper reduction in emissions than we had prior to it. This is the kind of great kind of unfreezing, I suppose, for me, that there are a set of things that we previously thought were out of scope for changing. And now coming out of COVID, I think we really are in the position to change things even more rapidly. If you think about some of the lifestyle changes that we've seen around, I'm speaking to you from my bedroom. I find that astonishing. These are things that would not have really been within scope just a few months ago. Well, if you can harness some of those changes in society positively, then you can come out of this, I think, in an even better position when it comes to the climate at the end of this, and potentially also a better position when it comes to the economy if we use those investments wisely. So, I mean, it's not to say this is going to be easy, but I do think that it is a kind of a moment, I suppose, for us to really examine what we think is important and focus on what will bring us to that global goal of mid-century net zero.
And I think I agree with you, because it seems to me that the pandemic actually creates that opportunity to look at things differently in a more holistic and joined up way. I've never before ever seen so many sectors coming together. And I think there is a confluence, and it's because of the COVID lens, which feels counterintuitive because that it just feels strange that we're looking at it that way. But I do think COVID has helped press the pause button. But do you think from a global perspective, every country is looking at it differently? Are they taking stock of that pause button and saying, actually, we need to come together?
So I don't claim to know the answer to that question, but I'm sure it's the case that many are not. but I mean, I point back to the kind of fundamentals of the economics here. This transition is going to go quickly if we accept that actually the alternatives to using fossil fuels look more and more appealing, and especially if the investor community grabs that. I mean, it seems to me that in the end, that's what's going to drive progress much more quickly than any single government or policy from any single government will. And for me, that's quite an exciting thing to be able to say. We haven't had those conditions in place before. But if you think about the COP next year, I mean, I talked about that in my opening remarks. But the COP's going to come at the end of an 18-month period, let's say, when governments around the world have been dealing with a pandemic, trying to ultimately stimulate their economies. And it seems to me that the COP is not just some sort of conference. It's also, the presidency of the COP is about the run up to that conference as much as it is about the conference itself. And I'm excited about that too, because I think if the role of the UK in the presidency of the COP is to stimulate the thought about a green recovery in governments and leaders around the world, then we do have that opportunity to tie this thing firmly together and to have a positive outcome at the end of it. So that for me is the challenge for the UK presidency over the next 12 months. We'll also have the presidency of the G7, so there's another kind of interesting angle in that. So climate's going to, I hope, run all the way through that as a sort of golden thread of how we recover well from COVID.
Can we take a couple of minutes just to talk more about the COP? Because, I talked about the looking forward to the 12-month countdown to Glasgow next year. And we're acutely aware that the eyes of the world are on Scotland and the UK. We've got a market-leading position. I don't think I'm inflating our position in the global terms in terms of clean energy. But can I have your views on how Glasgow's presidency of the COP could and should foster international cooperation? I think the UK has a huge amount to offer the world in terms of our market-leading expertise, consultancy, engineering, and a variety of other financial expertise to deliver what is needed. What are your views on what we can do in the next 12 months to make this COP the most impactful?
Well, I firmly agree with the premise behind your question there. So, I mean, let's just think about the COP for a second. So we're going to have, at the end of next year, we will have every world leader, I hope, at least most of them here in Glasgow. Amazing to think that they will all be here, and Glaswegians will show them a good time, I'm sure. That it's important actually to say that feeling of optimism will really help, I think. But there's a lot more kind of writing on all of this that that we need this thing to be a bit more than just a sort of UN rulebook conference, which is what has often characterized some of the previous COPs. For me, the story of net zero is a much more important thing overall. So, the UN process, which of course the COP is driven by, as it should be, is about national commitments. So we have these things, the nationally determined contributions. And I have a feeling that next year, if all we look at is the NDCs from each country, then we are not going to see the kind of positive progress that I was just talking about. So actually, if you add up those global commitments at the moment, that's what takes you to about that outcome of about 3 degrees of warming, 3 degrees C of warming. Actually, though, peer beneath that, and there's a set of much, much more positive things going on. These are the kind of global transitions that transcend the national boundaries, and where I think the UK has a lot to offer. So it's firmly and foremostly about moving the basis of electricity production away from coal. That's something that we have done very successfully here in the UK, particularly in Scotland. So we've closed all the coal-fired power plants. We're almost at the end of the journey of decarbonising power production in Scotland, which is an amazing story to tell to the world. Converting from closing coal into a story of growing renewable power, also nuclear power, is kind of one of those big global transitions that I think is really accelerating at the moment. Tied very firmly to that is another one, which is about what we do with transport. So this move from the internal combustion engine vehicle to electric vehicles is going to take out, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of emissions here in the UK. And that's a story that you see in running right the way through the kind of global transition as well. And increasingly, that is a cost negative transition, we think. So it's actually cheaper to use electric vehicles over the coming decades than it is to keep using petrol and diesel vehicles. Really amazing progress can come through that. And then you have a set of other transitions which are not really national at all, they are global. The hydrogen transition I talked about, the story of deindustrializing industry and with it carbon capture. And then the other big story is land use change. So what we do in the natural environment to tie all this together. These are fundamentally international stories, which I think tell a much more positive story of progress than the nationally determined contributions alone will. Now, I hope we have some really strong NDCs to go alongside all of that. But for me, that's the really exciting thing about the COP, is to bring out these global stories of transition, tie them together so that we do feel and do see that we're on the cusp of something that will happen very rapidly, and that the investor community supports that. And it seems to me that's the challenge for COP. It's not just to have a good conference, which I'm sure Glasgow will deliver.
Indeed. Now, you mentioned 5 or 6 things in your previous answer there, Chris. The closure of coal, the phase out of diesel and petrol vehicles, the decarbonisation of buildings, which I know is circa 40% in terms of carbon, industry decarbonisation and the transition into renewables, as well as land use change. That in itself is mind-blowing in terms of CapEx, which leads me on to the question of investment opportunity.
Yeah.
You talk about 50 billion, 1% of GDP. Can we talk about how best the finance sector can play their part in all of this? We know liquidity isn't an issue. We've got a range of delegates who've logged in this morning, who amongst them are accountable for trillions in terms of asset management. The money is there, but what needs to happen next?
So I do think it starts with leadership. You do need political leadership on this. So the background story of the positive economics didn't happen by magic. It happened with solid policy efforts to scale up these low carbon solutions for power that I talked about, to the point when they could be deployed at scale and at best price to the consumer. That is a policy story. It's a story of industry responding. It's often, though, not the story that is not told is the finance story behind that. So, that for me is the model. We have to roll that out in all the other sectors of the economy. And I suppose behind that has to be a feeling that we can do this. This is a kind of optimistic story that will see us drive the pace of change even more quickly into the future. For me, that does start with political leadership. So we need those policies to be put in place, but we also need to think of them not just as subsidies. This is not really a story about government subsidies or taxpayer subsidies, call them what they are. That may be necessary at the outset of some of these technological transitions, but also we need to think about that, the government eventually kind of stepping out and allowing the regulatory markets and regulation itself to drive that transition at scale. And then comes with that the manufacturing scale that drives the cost down for the consumer. These technological transitions can be easily financed. The thing I think we haven't talked enough about is the business model transitions that go with that. Mm-hmm. So that also needs to be financed. And I am very much of the view that we have to support the incumbents to transition, not imagine that we're going to kind of throw everything up in the air and have a whole new set of market entrants deliver you net zero. So we need to talk about what's happening with the oil and gas majors. We have to talk about the financial sector itself and where it puts its capital. We also perhaps have to talk about how regulation can drive that. So the TCFD framework seems to me is absolutely essential to that. But all of this is coming together. So, I mean, I have a feeling that over the course of the next 12 months, we'll be talking much more positively about these things. I suppose my message to you is that the policymakers and our leaders need to hear this. They need to hear that the finance community is ready for this, that it's, again, it's not this hair-shirted transition that I talked about in my opening remarks. And actually, it's a positive, sensible investment prospectus that can be financed cheaply. And that overall, although it is capital intensive, that the transition itself will be cheap because the cost of capital is low.
I agree with all of that. I mean, we have talked previously about the coordinated plan required for the next 3 decades, but the requirement for that to be put in place in the next 5 to 10 years. To what extent do you think there needs to be a forum where you've got the developers, the oil majors, the financial sector and government actually coming together? The COP is one thing, but that's very different from what we're talking about in terms of changing the market and actually driving things forward. What would you say would be the key things that are necessary to bring all those people together?
Yeah, I think you're entirely right. I mean, it is often the case that we talk about this as just a problem for government, and of course that is not the case. What we really need is, of course, the strong policies from government, but also the strong industry response and the strong response from the finance community as well. So this is a problem of real deep collaboration. And again, we have really good stories in the UK of what we've done. That story of offshore wind is probably the best. You know, we've moved from that being a very, very, very expensive technological transition to being utterly remarkably the cheapest form of electricity generation. And that happened because we had a well worked through process that used those policy tools effectively. And we saw the big scale bringing, the cost reductions for the consumer at the end of that. It's that kind of transition that we will need in other sectors. So we need it particularly for industry. We need it for transport. Each one of those transitions looks different to the power sector, though. So we've got to come together. I'm a big fan of making a plan that has broad endorsement so that you get this certainty that I talked about that drives the cost of capital to be low. That looks more and more like quid pro quo arrangements where we are clear that decarbonisation is the goal, but we work out between government and industry and consumer and finance communities what that transition looks like so that it can be financed cheaply. Now, I don't think it's that difficult to do that. So I'm not suggesting that getting to net zero is not going to be a challenge. It is, but if you break it down into its component parts, we can pick out a handful of things that we know will be important and really focus on how we make that transition happen at the lowest cost to the citizen. Let's call it what it is. That to me is really exciting because it's going to drive that investment that I talked about at the scale that it's necessary to drive it at. And that investment is the tool of renewal when it comes to the post-COVID world. That's where the jobs are. That's the story of regional economic renewal that goes alongside all of this. So I don't think it's that difficult if we break it down into the component parts, the things that will really deliver net zero. It's true in the UK. It will be a slightly different story in other countries of the world, but it won't be that different. And of course, the other part of that story is we can learn from those other transitions happening elsewhere. So the UK alone doesn't need to do everything. It can benefit from the transitions that are happening elsewhere. So that story that I told you on electric vehicles, for example, is partly a story about driving down the cost of low carbon electricity here in the UK. That will be the fuel for those electric vehicles. It is also a story of manufacturing taking place elsewhere of batteries, also the vehicles themselves, and use of those vehicles here in the UK with different market models around it. All of that is really exciting. All of that can be brought together and we can make a plan around that. That's really where we look to our political leaders to lead that. But let's bring together, let's not have these kind of siloed discussions any longer. Let's bring together the various market participants and spell out a plan that gets us to net zero by 2050 at the very latest.
I agree. Do you think there is merit in convening a forum where we do explore the different aspects of collaboration? We talked earlier about the UK's market leading position. Offshore wind is an enormous success story. And if we look at your CCC report on net zero, as I say, the numbers are quite frightening in terms of where we are just now in terms of installed capacity and where you'd like us to be in 10 years, which as I understand it is quadrupling the number of gigawatts that are installed in the sea. How do you see us collaborating with the international community to import that battery expertise, for example, and export the offshore wind expertise?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with, I said earlier that it shouldn't be viewed as a solely technical endeavor, but I think there is merit in understanding some of the technical components of what we need to do to get to net zero, because that allows you to build a feeling of what deployment would look like of the various solutions. And the numbers here are amazing. I mean, it is remarkable to think what the world will need to look like. It's not just a scientific imperative; it's also the law of the land. So this is the journey that we are now wedded to here in the UK, and other countries around the world have similar targets and statutory frameworks to deliver this. So this is the transition. The more that globally it's a transition, the cheaper it will be. So we will draw from the best stories around the world, including that story on batteries that you talked about. And that, I think, requires us to look at what kind of deployment rates you would need to achieve of some of the key components of that to get a handle on it. So, I mean, that's partly what we are doing in the CCC this year. So the Committee on Climate Change has a role every 5 years of offering to the government and to Parliament in the UK our assessment of what the next interim target should be for carbon reduction. So they're called the carbon budgets in the UK. Later this year, we will provide the next piece of advice on the next carbon budget, which crucially is going to be the target for the mid-2030s. And that's really important. This will be the first carbon target that the UK has set since setting the long-term goal to net zero, so net zero by 2050. And we'll be advising on what the target should be in the 2030s. But never mind all of that, what we'll actually be advising on is the things that must be done over the course of the next 10 to 15 years to be genuinely on track for net zero. So we'll be able to spell out for the UK what we think the pathway for emissions looks like from here to net zero, and crucially, we'll be able to say what the deployment looks like of the various solutions and changes that we need to see in the economy to deliver that. And I mentioned one of the key points in my earlier comments, which is that we need to get to a point by 2030 or thereabouts, certainly the early 2030s, when every new investment, every single change of capital asset is from high carbon to zero carbon. And it is worth thinking about that in terms of the turnover of capital assets. I think we're now down to the point where we should be thinking about the lifetime of capital assets as being a key determinant of success here. If you think about that, then that kind of sweet spot of reaching the point where we're ready for every investment in the early 2030s to be zero carbon is the challenge before us now. So we're going to have to scale up every policy, every deployment metric to get to that goal in the early 2030s. It's entirely possible to do that. The numbers are big. So, behind this is a transition in the energy system that needs to be financed, and it is big. It is. We're talking about achieving something we have never really achieved before. A huge scale up in electricity generation, and all of that needs to be low carbon. We talk in the UK more and more about offshore wind being the backbone of that. So yes, you're right, Claire, that by 2030 we are going to have at least 30 to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind. We probably have about 10 at the moment. By 2050, that'll need to be more like 100 gigawatts. So, we're talking about, and probably more than that. So that's, that amazing scale up over that period. And similarly, the scale up in the other parts of the energy system is also similarly awesome. So I talked about hydrogen as being a really important new part of that story. That's a new low carbon fuel, an energy vector. That might be the energy storage medium of the future. That needs to be scaled up from practically nothing now to being a sector that is almost as big as the electricity generation sector is today by 2050. So these are big steps that need to be invested in. And alongside that, just as you say, Claire, these things need to be viewed in the global scale. So behind all of this will be a set of transitions happening elsewhere, a set of positive stories, I hope, happening elsewhere around solar, for example, battery progress. These things we will benefit from too. So I think more and more we need to think about what we can specialize here in the UK and drive that as hard as we can, and expect that as more and more of the world comes under the net zero goal, as more and more world GDP is under that net zero goal, that we'll be able to draw from those positive stories elsewhere to make the transition even more achievable here in the UK.
Thank you, Chris. We've only got a minute or so left, and I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball because I'm conscious that you took part in a climate assembly, which was a citizens get together with a number of representatives from all walks of life in the UK. Because whilst we're talking about 1% of GDP, 50 billion, and the enormous opportunities that are out there, this is a personal thing. Bringing it down, right down to citizen level, and the changes that we need to make as individuals in terms of our lives. Can I invite you just to make a couple of observations about what you've learned from that assembly?
Well, you again, really good question, Claire, because it's very tempting just to think of this as, a set of technical transitions that need to be financed. But of course, it's much, much more than that. Just to give you a stat on that, we looked at the emissions reductions necessary to get to net zero in the UK from today. What we saw is that about a third of them involve technological change only. But most of them, 2/3 of them, involve some element of change in society. So change in behavior, change in society. None of that is scary, but it means that we have to have a different sort of discussion. We need to open up the discussions, what's sometimes called the just transition, how fair this transition will be. Where are we going to have people in jobs over that transition? How is that going to change over time, and how will people be supported into that? And how will people's lives change? And that's what the Climate Assembly was about. So the Climate Assembly in the UK was a really wonderful thing to be involved with. It involved 108 real people carefully selected from across the UK to be genuinely representative of people living in the UK. Selective by where they lived, by their age, by their ethnicity, but also crucially by what they thought about climate change itself. So you had a set of people who were not climate advocates, and we asked them a simple question with a much more complicated answer. How should we get to net zero? Not whether we should get to net zero, but how. And the fascinating thing for me was that group of people went on a journey over the 6 weekends where we took them through this process. They moved very quickly to understanding the issues with information provided to them. And that was something they really wanted to see happen for the rest of the populace. to really understanding the things that would drive emissions down to net zero and supporting them, crucially. And that for me is a real lesson. So we have to stop hiding this issue away, I think, from the people living in this country and around the world. We have to start having an honest discussion about what's coming. And it turns out that people are sensible when it comes to the, this transition. They understand the risks and they support the solutions. And that's a message to ministers, to leaders around the world, not just in the UK. Trust the people, let them have that kind of information and they will support it. And I think that's something we're going to have to see more and more of, or this transition will be very disruptive in the wrong way. And I might say it's going to be unlikely to be successful if we don't have that kind of engagement. So I think there are some really good stories about what's been happening in the UK and in Scotland about that. Other parts of the world are doing it too. Look at France, they have their own French Citizen Assembly. More of these things I think would be helpful.
Chris, that's a great point to end on. I have an image in my head of descending that mountain with you as my Sherpa, and I don't think I'll get rid of that image for a long time. Thank you so much for your insights and thoughts and for your time this morning. Thanks to GEFI for inviting us both to speak this morning. And to the delegates, I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you very much indeed.